Because people failed to accept and explore the
Walt Bismarck show.
which turned out to be factually correct.
1492! Bismarck, meet Walt Bismarck. He's an advocate for you and me. From the town of his co-ethnics are his cup of tea. He'll work with his roommate down the hall to bring forth the New World Order's fall. When you're with Walt Bismarck, have a 1492 time, an ethno-state time. We'll have a high trust time. Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Walt Bismarck Show. I'm Walt Bismarck and I am joined by my co-host, Walt's roommate.
Hello, everybody.
Walt's roommate is once again the mod of the terrific subreddit r debate alt-right. Go check that out. Also, go give me a follow over on Twitter at WAITBISMARCK.
Wait Bismarck.
Wait Bismarck, yes. I've been trying to have lower time preference lately, so it's quite appropriate. So we have a long list of topics to discuss for you guys today. I think for first order business, we should discuss the concept of different American nations, different nations or ethnicities, we might say, within white America.
One thing that we've been thinking for a long time, especially with regards to separatism or pan-separatism or white separatism, is that while obviously diversity adds an important aspect to the separation question, I think that it's undeniable, just based on how even white people in America have split apart, that even if we set diversity aside and we imagine an all-white America where, you know, cultural differences still exist between, say, the North, the South, the Midwest, the Far West, I think that we should actually still consider, I mean, is the American project worth continuing in its current form? I mean, is this idea of just all these disparate white people, should we be inherently biased towards actions that propel that and keep it going?
Having a multi-ethnic empire of whites, essentially, within the American nation. Or should we have like an ethnogenesis bonding all these groups together into one coherent ethnicity?
Yeah, you see this in, well, I mean, for instance, one of the sort of shit-lib talking points is they say there's no white culture in Europe, and okay, I mean, when you try and get big-brained with that, what they really mean is like there's a million white cultures in Europe and it's just not one uniform culture throughout. But you could make that same point about the US, and I do wonder if that should have the same kind of resolution that Europe does. I mean, French culture is different from Swedish culture, so we leave those as two different nations.
I think a lot of people see America, there's a common position on the alt-right where they want ethno-nationalism for Europe. They want all these disparate cultures to remain distinct and have different states corresponding to them, but they want America to be the sort of pan-European racial state as opposed to ethno-state that exists for all white people and is a kind of, you know, common focal point for our entire race, to be, in a sense, a fourth Rome. And I'm sympathetic to that worldview, and in a sense, I'm an advocate of it, but I do think that people underestimate the extent to which you would have to bond, yeah, as we said earlier, these very different ethnic groups within white America together in order to make that work.
Yeah, okay, moving around the country, I mean, just seeing a lot of different areas, and both of us have seen a lot of different areas in the country. I mean, when I go to a place, now, you know, I'm from the Northeast, and I didn't actually realize how much, like when I was touring the South, when I was kind of getting in touch with it, and when I was sort of seeing what that was like as a culture, I felt a lot like I would feel if I was on a Euro trip, if I was seeing a totally foreign, different nation full of white people. I avoided all the black parts.
Right. You know, it's funny, in I think the 18th, 19th century, they used to do something called a grand tour, where young men of social privilege would spend a few weeks in every European country, kind of getting acquainted with its local culture, understanding the values, the cuisine, the, you know, festivities, all the different eccentricities of every culture they'd stop in, and also getting acquainted with the history of each nation, going through all the museums, checking out the art scene, checking out the high culture in each society. And it was a way to sort of groom the European aristocracy and make them understand the differences between all these nations so they could be more effective diplomats, intellectuals, and so on. And I think it was a very good practice. And I think that Americans, especially since it's logistically much more easy nowadays to see the nation, to go on a road trip, something like that, especially if you're, you know, in college or something, I think it really behooves us to do something similar, especially if we're going to be white nationalists, if we're going to be in the business of trying to create a racial state in this nation, to understand all the profound cultural differences that you see across these regional divides. Because in the same way that you often hear the argument that we shouldn't forge all the nations of Europe, all the cultures of Europe, into one monolithic sort of pan-European identity, I think one could very easily make a similar case about the U.S., that all of these distinct white cultures are individually valuable. They have their own unique contributions, their unique merits, and they could easily as be independent ethno-states as the nations of Europe. What are your thoughts?
I think that it's easy to imagine from the perspective of somebody trying to found the US or sort of found a new group of white people. It's easy to kind of think of all of the, I'm going to use the word diversity in Europe as a kind of historical accident, as if there's another world where the Roman Empire just kept on going forever, conquered Germany, and just moved forward as a pan-European state, and as if it's kind of a big tragedy that Europe never really united and never became one group, and that there never became one prevailing white culture that conquers all. But I think that that's kind of denying our nature as white people. White people we do kind of have some hipster dynamic to us where we all want to be different from everybody else. If there was a European culture, like, one European culture, that culture would be the culture of becoming different from everyone else, or trying to not even aggressively counter-signal everyone else for moral reasons, but to sort of show the differences between you and them, and also this kind of ruthless competitiveness to show that you are the best. And I think that it's denying ourselves something very big, like a very big part of ourselves, to move apart and explore different pieces and try and be very unique, and maybe not individualistic in the sense of the individual, but in the sense of the individual group.
So do you think, in a sense, that being a big monolithic empire is contrary to white nature? Because one thing, a lot of people will compare the Roman Empire to China, because if the Roman Empire had prevailed, it would essentially be a white China. It would be similar in terms of population, in terms of just being a regional hegemon with no real equal in the area, in the same way that China was. I mean, China has different ethnic groups within it, but we kind of just think of them as the Han Chinese, even though the Han Chinese have different, constituent divisions underneath that group, because I think it's sort of in the Asian nature to unify and be more monolithic and not rock the boat, whereas it's in the white nature to fragment, to, as you say, be hipster, to kind of forge our own path in the world. And that's why the Roman Empire ultimately did fall. That's why we did have countless divisions throughout the ages. That's why white empires tend to be not necessarily as stable as Asian empires, but we tend to have a lot more innovation in our societies. It's sort of a trade-off. We lose some stability, but we gain innovation as a consequence. I think it's what happens when you take that high IQ, but you fuse it with high T, also a high propensity to novelty, things like that, and it causes us to be willing to be revolutionary more, and that sort of precludes the existence of these long-lasting hegemonic empires like you see in Asia.
Well, number one, I actually don't agree with the idea that there ever sort of was a unified Roman Empire. The Rome was lasted for a very long time, so it's hard to make a full generalization of the state of the empire. But for most of its history, Rome kind of was, there wasn't even Italian preeminence, because Rome and sort of the Roman culture sort of originated, and you were specifically Roman within central Italy, not even necessarily north or south.
It took a lot of time for the Italians to gain citizenship, right?
And by the time they got it, they actually didn't even want it.
Right.
It was better to be an Italian than it was to be a Roman, because you had all the rights and prestiges of being a Roman, but you didn't have to pay taxes. The reason for
it's like Puerto Rico.
Well, the reason for this was because the Romans wanted those closest to them, those surrounding them, to be the most satisfied, because, if everyone's rebelling, Rome at least wants to know Italy is in its pocket. But as Rome kind of, it sort of set up this big infrastructure, a lot of people think Rome had a plunder economy. That's false. The kind of economy Rome had was that it had not only tons of good fertile land, but over a large swath of area. And if you can walk from Britain to the Middle East under one government, one set of rules, one not that there was only one language, but you would at least speak the same. There would be one language everyone could use. You
Greek?
could communicate with everyone. Actually, Greek was, I think, it was pretty much among at least rich people as popular as Latin, right?
Yeah, it wasn't. I thought Greek was the lingua franca of like the traders and the everything like that.
Of like any Roman who was worth anything. A lot of people don't know this. When the Bible was translated to Latin in the Middle Ages, that was actually to dumb it down for like uneducated, because the Romans, it was like the language of the poor people.
Small brain language. And Greek was the big brain language.
Yeah, but then because like the small brain language was what everything was kind of put into, it kind of became big brained.
Right.
But so, anyways, that was the kind of economy Rome was just setting up this really big infrastructure, this big trade, this big everything. And as it kind of set that up and everybody could be a part of it, those different regions of Rome, which by the way still had their identity, even if it was an identity Rome had to build. I mean, the way Rome, for instance, probably built the English wealth and Gallic identity. But, let's ignore that for now. When these areas kind of were big and strong enough to self-actualize, they found after the crisis of the 3rd century that they just didn't really need Rome anymore. Italy was still like obviously richer than Gaul, but there was no real reason to be under Italy's foot. And so, when all these invasions were happening, the people in, for instance, Gaul just found it easier to defend themselves and not wait for the imperial armies to come by. Plus, the imperial armies, there were these really difficult logistical issues of like, where do we actually put the military? Because if we put it all out there, then some charismatic general will overthrow the emperor, and if we put it all in here, in Rome where they rule, then it's not out there, and they'll just be invaded by Germans. So there was this kind of like regionalization towards the end of the Roman Empire, or not even the end. I mean, there was still 200 years left in the Western Empire, but there was this intense regionalization where people were kind of very interested in themselves, their local culture, their local area, their local identity, and they kind of looked to their local leadership. Now, as places kind of went through this process, there wasn't actually a repudiation of the Roman identity. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the Gallic Empire, which was the Gallic succession.
It was the opposite. Everybody wanted to be Roman. And, I mean, they were fighting amongst themselves over who was the most Roman. They still do that today. I mean, the Italians and the Romanians and the Spanish all argue over whose language is closest to Latin. I mean...
Well, the Gallic Empire was kind of created for a very specific reason. I mean... There was, as bad as things were in Gaul, because like the Germans were like invading a lot, it was like worse in the east because the Persians were invading, and so the emperor made what is probably a sound decision to send your armies out east to fight an actual like real rival civilization in the Sassanid Empire rather than to fight some barbarian raiders. But if you're a Gaul, you're like, okay, but what about my estate?
Right.
So they never repudiated Rome. They just thought logistically they didn't belong in that culture. And as things kind of became more and more unified, towards especially the end of the empire, you just don't really hear a coherent narrative of Rome after a while. I mean, even as late as certainly the Valentinian dynasty, I mean, certainly towards the end of it, you kind of wonder what it even means to be Roman in the way that you don't wonder under the rule of Trajan or Augustus.
But at the same time, Rome remains a metaphysical ideal for whites, and it is sort of a story we feel we all belong to. I mean, there's a reason
and
that
we do belong to it.
There's a reason that the Germans, the Russians, I mean, basically every civilization that had a great empire in the years following, they made their.
It's also, I mean, you name
Kaiser,
the Germans
Tsar,
and the Russians in particular, like the two groups that like were never actually in the Roman Empire.
Right, they were like, the ones who had to call themselves Kaiser and Tsar, right? I mean, it's.
Yeah. So no, I mean, when I say that I wonder about white unity, the point that I kind of mean, I'm not against white unity in a sort of spiritual sense in the way that, I think ancient Rome does bind all white Americans to all Russians, to all, to all these people. And I do think part of the reason why I have a hard time saying that I share an ethnicity with a non-white in America is because even if you have like a completely assimilated, Chinese person or whatever whose family has been in America since like before.
He doesn't give a shit about Rome.
Yeah, the fact that at the end of the day, I'll talk about Rome as I'm prone to do, and he will
His eyes will glaze over.
Yeah, his eyes will glaze over. Like, he wasn't there, and I
Well,
imagine...
it might be a little hard to tell, but...
Well, I imagine that from his point of view, it's like hearing about a dream that you weren't in or that you weren't having, and it's like you just don't belong in that history.
Mm-hmm.
But so, I also think, though, that the localization of Rome, I mean, there was something important to the fact that, you know, these different regions localized and felt comfortable with one another, and they had only really done the whole unified Europe thing because Rome had kind of invented civilizations, you know, Greeks be damned. Rome had kind of invented civilization and moved it towards them and could kind of up them to the wealth and prestige and civilization that brings somebody into a society worth living.
Mm-hmm.
But barring that, and it is barring that in the U.S., I mean, the South doesn't need the North in any sense. The North or the South, neither of them needs California. I mean, we don't have this necessity. We have this huge division, and it bothers us in very big ways. Like, I think Jared Taylor said, and I'll kind of echo his point, that he wouldn't mind if there was a region that was multicultural and paused and just everything. He would just prefer if there was also a white nation.
Mm-hmm.
I actually wouldn't even mind necessarily if there was a region that wanted to run the multicultural experiment, and I might be a little sad if it had to be the Northeast, which unfortunately it probably would be. Honestly.
No, when you say multicultural, do you mean also multiracial?
Oh, that's what I meant.
Right, okay.
I wouldn't actually mind if that happened, and I actually wouldn't even mind if just due through the pause cycle, if we watch that nation go for, you know, if that nation was like the nation state of Vermont, I wouldn't mind even just watching as that white population as an experiment goes from 97% white to 0% white, because it would be scholarly interesting, and it wouldn't be a threat to the white race as a whole. It would just be, you know, it would be sad, but
right.
no more sad than World War II.
That would be a useful counterexample.
It would be no more sad than, like, I don't know, what's a war that about 600,000 whites died in?
Civil War?
Was it really that many?
Yeah, 600,000. Yeah, it was like that many on both sides. Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. Well, no, but I think you made a useful point, because all throughout white history, I mean, even in the Middle Ages, the Habsburg Empire fell, Napoleonic France fell, obviously Nazi Germany fell. Whenever a white hegemon attempted to establish itself, it was kind of broken down by smaller states seeking to maintain balance of power and seeking to maintain individual liberty and self-determination for all the different ethnic groups. It seems to be just a trait of white people generally. And in fact, this has been, a lot of historians will attribute what they call the Great Divergence, which was where the West, Europe, just massively started to outshine the rest of the world technologically. They'll attribute that to the greater competition between European states in the early modern period. They'll say that while the East had all these regional hegemons, the Mings, the Mughals, the Ottomans, who were just so overwhelmingly powerful that they had no local competitors and they had no reason to innovate, and they just kind of stagnated. The West had all this internal competition, so you had, you know, the British and the Dutch fighting, the Spanish and the French fighting, all the different Italian states fighting against each other, and that caused it to just technologically start to surpass the rest of the world, because they had to be on the cutting edge constantly. They had to be constantly innovating. Now, I think this theory has two main flaws with it. One, there are plenty regions of the world where you had equal political fragmentation and you didn't see the same kind of technological development. These are areas that we know today to just have lower average IQs. So, I mean, I think that's pretty straightforward. We could get into like the Jared Diamond thing, but if you're listening to this, you probably know why that's bullshit. So, you know. And the other issue I take with this theory is that I think it just gets the causality wrong. I mean, I do agree that whites being competitive, it probably did cause us to innovate, but it was sort of a feedback loop. Like, we were competitive because of our nature as white people. So really, if we're going to get into the causality of it, it's right to attribute our success to our nature as white people, which is to be more fractious by nature. And I think that's what actually happened. I think that Asians, they're very high IQ, but they're not as novelty-seeking as we are. They don't have that same masculine impulse to go conquer, to go fight, to go, to really have individual agency as much. They're much more kind of slavish and supplicative by nature. Whereas white people, we want to be free and independent, and if we're going to be led, we have to be led by someone strong and impressive. And I think as a consequence of that, we're just more prone to breaking apart. And I think that's what happened numerous times throughout history.
Well, I think that we break apart actually differently from the Asians. I mean, in terms of whether, like, I don't know, whenever I get on arguments on, like, Debate Alt-Right or something with shitlibs who say that there's no unified white identity or that Europe is so fractured or whatever, one of the interesting things about the way that Europe fractures versus the way that Asians fracture. I mean, sure, Asians can do things that as far as I can see, there's just no chain of events that will lead to us doing. There are, I forgot if there's more or less than, but about 1 billion Chinese people in China held together for God knows how long, being Chinese. I mean, we are never going to match that feat with one country. It's just not going to happen. But at the same time, if you talk to people in China and about, disputes between China and Japan, if Japan wins one, the Chinese do not see it as legitimate. The Chinese will never celebrate a Japanese victory over Japan. And in a way that almost sounds obvious, but that actually is not something that I think Europeans can relate to. Both the English and the French can celebrate the 100 Years' War. People whose ancestors hung out in the Roman Empire can still enjoy the culture of the Germans at the time, insofar as we know much about it.
For modern day Europeans, it's almost like a source of just banter and fun between them. They like reliving their histories and talking about how their historical stories are kind of interacting and changing over the years. And I mean, the French or the Germans or the French or the English, like they have these interesting historical relationships that nowadays can just be a source of both unity and just banter, and it's an interesting dynamic.
And we also see cases with, like, between Sweden and Denmark. I don't know if they're number one. They might actually be. And I also don't know if it's any countries that have ever existed or countries that exist now.
Right.
But they've fought, like, the most wars between each other of, like, anybody. And we all know, I mean, Scandinavia is pretty closely knit. I mean, if you're a Frenchman who like, goes after Denmark in some way, like, if you're... the Swedes will fight with will side with the Danes instinctively. I think that insofar as, our, what do you call it, the Great Distinction?
Great Divergence.
In the Great Divergence and all of this, I mean, if something happens in Europe, if for instance, like, Germany comes up with really great technology or structure because they have to go fight the French or something like that happens, I mean, the French people will still kind of celebrate the German advancement as if they did it, because by creating that competition and kind of doing the Europe thing of constantly fighting and unifying and get together and so on, the French were in the process of that German invention.
And it's sort of a European tradition to celebrate the national heroes of other nations that were direct combatants against you. I mean, there's a reason we all love Rommel today. There's a reason that the English will celebrate Joan of Arc, right? There's a reason that the Russians will celebrate someone like Charles XII of Sweden. There's a reason that Gustavus Adolphus might be celebrated in Germany. These people who might have been historical enemies of the people that they were fighting, but they still were viewed as larger-than-life heroes that were a source of admiration. Whereas I don't really think in Asia, like, I'm sure the Japanese who carried out the rape of Nanking aren't going to be celebrated anytime in China, you know?
We also do it in reverse. I mean, the idea that, Americans whose families fought against Hitler can be shamed by things related to Hitler. I mean, I think that's just an extraordinary, like loop-de-loop of identity. I mean, I almost don't even, I think that is very underappreciated how unified people feel to that, and how even somebody fighting who thinks that their family was like fighting against everything they think Hitler stood for, the fact that that's so powerful in the imaginations of the people who defeated the Nazis, that's astounding to me. That just almost shouldn't be possible, at least by sort of like basic bitch assumptions about how identity works.
Right. Millennial Woes frequently makes the point that in the UK, you would never shame, nobody would ever shame like a black Jamaican immigrant or something for what the Brits did to Ireland. Like the very idea that would be ridiculous. But
you would shame the Brits for what the Germans did to the Brits.
Yeah, exactly. exactly. It's so fucked up. But no, it's true. There is this sort of spiritual white unity, even when it works against us, that's so pervasive throughout our culture. And I do think it goes back to ancient Rome. It goes back to the idea of Christendom. I think that's another powerful element that historically, served as a unifying force. But white people do have this sense of racial identity. Anyone who countersignals that is ridiculous. But at the same time, we do have, I think, a lot of important ethnic divisions that that are going to lead themselves to political fragmentation. So sometimes I do wonder whether the idea of an ethno-state, or I guess we shouldn't use the phrase ethno-state, we should use the phrase racial state, is tenable, given that white people, it's just in our nature to break apart. And sometimes I feel like a lot of white nationalists will try to almost project Asian tendencies onto white people. I mean, we're never going to be China. We're never going to unite the white race into this one massive hegemon that'll just stay stable and not experience any internal divisions that'll rock it apart. I mean, we're not going to be Shogun in Japan. We're not just going to be racially isolationist. I mean, white people are novelty seeking. White people are sort of xenophilic. White people like to see the world and explore, and I feel like denying that is against our nature. I mean, even if we look at Rome, and we were this unified hegemon for a while, as Walt's roommate pointed out, we always had those internal divisions within the empire. The empire broke apart however many times in its history. It had all those civil wars. It had all these instabilities. I think that you're, in a sense, denying a very important part of the white nature in acting like we can just put apart our issues and come together and have this uncomplicated ethnogenesis. We're always going to be splitting apart.
Yeah, as white nationalists, it's important that we be, nationalists for the white race that actually exists, and
Right.
not some, I'm not even going to call it idealized white race, because I actually don't think that that's a more idealized thing. I don't think that people are better
it would
if
be
they can
horrible.
be a hive mind than if they can be 50 different...
I don't want us to be like Asians. I'm glad that we're like the way we are.
countries in Europe?
Oh, God, I don't know. I mean, yeah.
I think it's 50, but don't quote me on that.
It should be around there. Yeah, I mean, I don't want us to be like Asians. I want us to be like how we were historically. That's the ideal.
And it's kind of a hard thing, I think, for a lot of people to wrap their minds around, let alone, discuss, let alone discuss rationally, is that we do need to, rather than, I think, trying to change the nature of white people to some kind of universal state that we can never actually be, and that we have never shown any evidence that we could ever be. Rather than try and do that, I think that what we should try and do is kind of come to terms with who we are and sort of discuss our differences and how we can, I'm not even going to say go our own way, because there actually is some, European unity, as much as we can talk about how different we are from, how we want sort of like the north-south to split apart from, the west and all of that. As much as we can talk about that, I do feel like it's a personal affront to me when I see Barbara Specter talking about sending a bunch of refugees to Europe. That even though I see that as a different group that should never be unified with us, at least not in a bureaucratic or authoritative sense, I do think that the unity between us that we sort of need to discuss kind of needs to be more metaphysical and sort of spiritual and kind of
Right.
both big-brained and small-brained at the same time.
Right, exactly.
Like big-brained in that it kind of gets you
It just
into,
can't
like,
be medium-brained.
metaphysical... Yeah, well, big-brained in that it gets you into kind of metaphysical world of forms type stuff that doesn't intersect with reality, but kind of small-brained in the sense that it doesn't actually answer any meaningful questions.
It's
of
like
how
animalistic. It's just instinctive almost.
Yeah, like when people say, like, how are you connected to Sweden? I don't actually give them an answer. I just say, like, well, I am.
Right.
And that's kind of one of the reasons why, and I think I brought this up a couple videos ago, is that the term I like to use now to describe myself is white person. Mm-hmm. Because there is a kind of unity to it, but it's kind of ambiguous what the political consequences are.
Right, right.
I also think I said in that video, I prefer the term white globalist to the term white nationalist.
Are you both a nationalist and a globalist?
I'm kind of both a nationalist and a globalist in a weird way. I mean, I mean, we are at the end of the day just sort of a global people.
Right.
Although, that's not to say all people are one united global people. It's to say white people are multiple sort of united global people.
That's another thing, is that we're never going to be confined to one continent. We're never gonna have like the ethno-state as the Shire, right? We're never gonna have this state where we're just comfortable staying where we are and having our little comfy existence and not wanting to expand and not wanting to exert our influence anywhere, not wanting to explore the world and interact with the rest of the world. We're never going to be like the Japanese. And what we have to do is look at our history, look at our past, look at who we are as a people, and find a dynamic that works within that context. We need to find a way to channel, as Spencer calls it, that Faustian spirit within us that doesn't leave us open to the same liabilities as colonization did historically, or the white man's burden, or modern globalization and pathological altruism. We have to find a way to sort of steer that course. And I think that once we adopt this new paradigm, it'll be a lot easier for us to have coherent political objectives. So bringing the conversation back to the U.S., as I said earlier, a lot of white nationalists want to see America as a fourth Rome. They want to see us as this melting pot of all these different European ethnicities, and America can be that sort of pan-European force in the world. So I guess the question becomes, what do we do with those essentially ethnic differences between us as white Americans as we try to move forward advocating for white interests and seeking to build some sort of ethno-state?
Well, I think that a lot of part of what this gets back to is I think that America, more than other parts of the world, is very susceptible to this kind of end of history narrative. And not because, we defeated the Soviets, there's no more strife left in the world or anything like that, but because if you actually look at our history, yes, for some period of time around the age of exploration and beyond, we sort of became the engine of world history, but we haven't always been that way. I mean, ancient Rome, for instance, was not the engine of Persian history or the engine of Chinese history. Our history, as we see it and as we understand ourselves, is a history of intra-European either fighting or competition or innovating, however you want to put it. And I think that the founding of America, with this sort of idea that even if we were, 50 different states competing with 50 forms of government, that there would be this unity, we wouldn't really be fighting, the states can't wage war. We sort of have this idea that, we can all come together and be done and we can do this 1960s thing. And to some extent, even the alt-right, while they're not willing to do the 1960s thing all around the world, do have this sort of idea of like a brotherhood of white men. And I don't necessarily go with that. I think that part of recognizing history is recognizing that these different and increasingly localizing identities will always be, hopefully not, with brothers' wars fought with guns and bullets and bombs, hopefully not that, but that war by other means, as they call it. I mean, in terms of these competitions and these divisions and these sort of things that happen, we do need to recognize that we will not see an end of history, even insofar as that history is inter-European competition, and insofar as there should be a brotherhood of man, it should be to recognize the regionalization and competition and all of that as legitimate and existentially interesting in what it says about who we are. So I think that what we have to do about this is we have to recognize that our history is not just as if this is some other crusade where we're only fighting a battle on front with diversity. I think we need to understand that part of the sort of strife we're in is that we are very differing people. Some factions or some sort of regional cultures of white people really do just want to commit suicide. Others really do want to live on, and we'll have to see. I mean, may the best man win, and whichever one of those turns out best. But I think that this is a kind of new paradigm or a way to go forward. It should be sort of the ideological blueprint of at least what I would want to do.
Maybe America should be seen as a fourth Rome, but it should also be seen as like we're now entering the sort of Middle Ages. Like maybe the idea should be that like
I thought you were gonna say crisis of the 3rd century.
Well, maybe that instead. Well, no, like I think you could view it as like we're all post-Americans, right? Like maybe white Southerners could see themselves as descendants of Americans and heirs to the American identity in a different way than New Englanders could, but they're still heirs to that identity, just in different ways. Like in the same way that like the Frenchmen and Spaniards might both see themselves as Romans, they just inherited different parts of Rome.
And post-American, I think, is a very good term.
Yeah, because we do have to recognize that we are operating in a different paradigm from Europeans. We are operating in a different world, but at the same time,
we're also operating in a different paradigm than our founding fathers were.
Well, absolutely.
Like, I'm sorry, I cringe so hard whenever anybody says that they're against tyranny.
Yeah.
Like if somebody's unironically counter-signaling King George, I just...
Well, the thing is, a lot of those Tea Partiers who were counter-signaling King George probably were indirectly counter-signaling Obama for racial reasons. They just needed some like white guy in a white wig to be the face of it. But in reality, they were probably just as racist as you and me.
Well,
on
that
a
is
visceral
probably
level.
true. I mean, if you deconstruct a lot of the times when people are talking about tyranny, they're not actually talking about tyranny.
Like, they'd be fine with Caesar being a tyrant over them. They just don't want some,
Half the people who like criticized Obama for his authoritarianism secretly want Trump to be,
as authoritarian as hell.
yeah, they actually do want him to like just come down with a fucking hammer on the entire world.
Right. Well, it's funny.
Nobody is sharing a God Emperor meme. Nobody ever wants their God Emperor to believe in the non-aggression principle.
Exactly. It's funny. I used to know a woman who was upset that her boyfriend, he was significantly older than her, probably in his 40s or 50s. He believed that Obama was a Kenyan, that he was born outside the U.S., and she thought it was just really stupid and was astounded that he believed that. And I explained to her, well, he doesn't actually believe that, or he might, but it's not, like, really what he's upset about at the end of the day is having a non-white ruling over him and determining his fate. And that's kind of a more politically correct, or at least more palatable to normies.
He's saying that Obama's not one of us.
Not one of us, and he has no right. He has no legitimate right to be my ruler, which I think I think that could be a perfectly compelling argument to a lot of normies if you phrase it the right way. But
it is also very easy to draw Obama's birth certificate is Kenyan. It is very easy to draw a parallel between that and even just saying like the problem with Obama is that he's not from Europe.
I mean, it's obviously a racist argument, right? I mean, like they can do their whole like, well, it's just about citizenship. If it were a black man, but it's like the thing is though, the only black men. It's weird in a sense because these people would love to have Ben Carson as their president to say that they're not racist, but the sort of black people, like they want extremely white presenting black people who like go out of their way to conform to their desires, and they'll elevate those people to extreme positions. But any black person who's actually in line with their self-interest, they will be extremely racist towards.
Well, what they want is to give puppet authority to a black man who they control.
Well, yeah.
I mean, you can say that the based black man who was made vice chairman of the RNC is really the one running the Republican Party because they're going to cuck to everything he says. But the thing is that the second that the based black man decides, like I'm actually going to make like the Republican plantation argument here. The second that this guy disagrees with American stuff, or not American stuff, with Republican stuff, the second he starts free thinking.
Look at Kanye. Remember that? I mean, they turned on him once he stopped doing the whole based black man bit. And
yeah,
that's just what it is. I mean,
the Republicans actually unironically do the thing that they use the phrase Democrat plantation to
disparage. Yeah, exactly.
Like they do that for the very few based black men in the Republican Party. They are on the Republican plantation, and they are only there insofar as they repeat what white people say.
And it's funny when black people call them Uncle Toms. I mean, like, there's a part of me that, on some level, I'll respect Herman Cain or Ben Carson or whatever, but there's also a part of me that finds them sort of viscerally disgusting. In the same way that, like, men don't respect their sycophants. Men don't respect people who suck up to them. And in the same way, like, I don't think historically, like, white colonizers necessarily respected, like, the Indian chieftain who gave them all their land for a bottle of liquor, or the collaborators, essentially, in colonial governments. I think that nobody respects the people who are willing to sell out their race. Nobody respects the guy who's going to sell out his people so he can have some momentary status within an out-group. And that's what a lot of these black Republicans do. And black people don't respect them. They call them Uncle Toms, and then we call those black people, Republicans call those black people racist for doing so. But it's very evident that there is something just viscerally disgusting about it, because they are going against their own people's self-interest. And I don't know if I can. I mean, sure. I mean, they're helpful to us. They're useful for us in the interim. But I'll treat them as a strategic tool. I won't treat them as somebody who's like honorably, working for some positive goal, because ultimately he's not one of us, and he just wants.
He just wants to repeat what we say, or I guess we the Republicans, not we the alt-right. He just wants to repeat what we say for not even like a millionaire's paycheck, for like a comfortable living.
He can have the benefits of living in white Christian conservative civilization and be part of that society and have people put him on a pedestal and do the whole bit. But he's not producing anything of actual value, and it's just really cringy.
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, I respect the black nationalist who just cares about his own interests more and is very open about that, and who doesn't try this weird scheme to try to get into conservative white society by sort of selling his own people short. And that is really what he's doing, because Republican policies just do concretely help white people. It's not that they're helping us at the expense of non-whites, except to the extent that Democratic policies are helping non-whites at the expense of us. So, stopping them is in effect doing the reverse. But yeah, I mean, if I'm a black person, like, am I going to be against anything the Democratic Party is doing? I mean, people are always saying, oh, the welfare, they're on the Democratic plantation. But I think that's a stupid argument, and nobody actually buys that. The thing is, if you're actually a black person in this country, I mean,
you probably should be a Democrat.
Yeah, you should. It's in your interest. It's not going to be in your interest to be an entrepreneur. It's not going to be in your interest to be self-sufficient.
Another group, though, that I do really like are the people who don't understand what you just said in the last 2 minutes, and that would be the boomer who has spent the last several decades. And at first it was started as some just some stupid bad faith rhetoric when they say, the Republican policies are really good for black people,
right,
and the Democrats are the real racist. At first it was just this stupid disingenuous rhetoric because what they really wanted to do was sort of assert their own interest as white people. And but over time what sort of happens, not even just over time, but as they get old enough that their brain starts to degrade,
they forget that it was a bit.
Yeah, they sort of genuinely begin to believe their own bullshit. And when you try to kind of reach these people and you try to just tell them the truth, what you kind of have to fight against is, number one, 50 years worth of, mainstream boomer conservatives have kind of created this culture of taking everything you might chalk up to race and kind of doing this crazy Rube Goldberg machine about how it's actually not racial. It's just that there happens to be some wild chain of events every single time anything happens that makes them happen to favor people who happen to all be white.
Exactly.
And moreover, it's just really hard to tell somebody that for the last 50 years they've been full of shit. I mean, some people have dedicated their entire lives to this stupid argument, and they're not going to abandon it just because what they're saying is obviously nonsensical. And I also would just like to point out there is this there is kind of a drop in status. If they're the boomer Republican arguing the Democrats are the real racist, then they go from the forward-thinking, embodies the values that America's had since the 1960s and is, the real hero of social justice and rights for all. And you kind of take them down multiple pegs down to you're some racist, incoherent guy who's been lying to people the last 50 years and unsuccessfully at that.
The thing is, though, the Democrats are the real racists. See, I think even its exponents have never really believed it to be an argument to non-whites. I think they all know on some level it's never been an argument to persuade non-whites to vote Republican. It's an argument made to persuade virtue-signaling whites to vote Republican because, those black people will be better off if they're entrepreneurs who aren't dependent on the government heat. That's what they're thinking, I think.
Or also just boomers who would, feel bad if there wasn't at least an argument, if there wasn't something to say.
That's the thing, is that they know it's not even substantive. They know it's not going to convince everybody, but they feel like they have to say it just because.
Well, there is kind of some advantage in an argument, like the merely having said something argument, okay?
Yeah.
Let me give you a story as an example. When I got my first job, I lied my ass off on my resume, and I said that I was an expert in Excel. I knew the program in and out, been using it for years, and I knew it so well that it was as if I could communicate telepathically with my computer. This was just my specialty. It's what I was all about. I'd be the best Excel guy in the world. So on my first day, naturally, I have no idea how to use the program, and I have to ask somebody, I think what I was asking them about was how to insert multiple rows in the same format.
Oh, Jesus.
Which, for those of you who don't know, that's lower than Excel 101. You should know how to do that, and if you don't know, hell, you could probably guess how to do it a lot faster than I did. It's not hard. And so this person, they say to me, they said, well, they just ask me, and even probably innocently, they go, is this your first time in Excel, or are you new to the program? And I'm not going to contradict my interview and my resume by saying that I'm not just going to say on my first day that I lied my ass off. So what I do is I kind of look them straight in the eye and I say with a voice that you would think I believe it myself, like as convincingly as I could, and even as innocently as I could, I go, no, I'm really good at Excel.
Right.
And and you understand there's this kind of inherent rhetorical thrust to that story, because while I'm sitting there like affirming a reality that is being disproved in front of both of us as we spoke, but what does the person say to it? I mean, they could just, I guess they could get really mean and just call me a liar and start doing all this thing, but they're probably not going to do that. What most people are going to do is exactly what this person did and just move past this ridiculous contradiction between what I was saying and the reality that we were both observing, and also the fact that they knew in 10 minutes I was going to be asking them how to do some other thing in Excel. So I think that that's kind of what's going on with Dems are the real racist, is that it is a kind of it is a kind of I know Excel tier argument where everybody knows that the Democrats are not only not the real racist, at least not racist against non-whites, hell, they are the non-whites. So, but the fact that the boomer can just say it in that sort of confident voice. No, of course you do get, some small faction of the left doing the asshole thing, and as if the person I was talking to had just called me out for lying about knowing Excel. But most people do just kind of like roll their eyes and move on as the boomer does the thing. And in the 90% white America that the boomer grew up in, it's actually okay for them if what they're saying is just like some stupid lip service, because they're ultimately not affected by laws that discriminate or businesses that
diversity is not an
discriminate
issue.
against black people.
They can just like hand wave it.
I'll even say that like I'll use the leftist thing. Like racism wasn't an issue for them, and racism did exist. I mean, I do accept that segregation stuff wasn't like a horrible thing we did to the blacks. But the idea that white people didn't generally like have some kind of animosity towards them, and that animosity didn't affect non-whites in America, I mean, that idea...
Isn't that what Jesse Lee Peterson says?
It might be. I don't know. I don't listen to him. But it's... Like, we should deny that segregation was some genocidal act of wickedness, but don't over-deny it. Blacks did face some racism. But since boomers were not affected by that racism and didn't care, they could easily just say this ridiculous, impotent point and just move on, in the same way that I could just give some impotent reassural that I knew Excel, and then I could just move on.
Right, but a problem starts to emerge as the American political narrative becomes increasingly racial. And as race becomes the primary delineation of American politics, the boomer narrative, which handwaves race in this obnoxious way, starts to actually become a liability. It's funny, the other day I was talking to a boomer conservative, about the cause of racial disparities in income between blacks and whites. And what I was trying to say is there are really only two coherent narratives. There's the alt-right narrative, which of course says that there are genetic differences in intelligence and time preference and work ethic that cause there to be these gaps. And then there's the leftist narrative, which says that it's due to some nefarious intentions of discrimination, of there being like institutional forces laid against them that cause them to underperform. And these are really the only two narratives you can have. The boomer conservative tries to say, oh, it's because they're dependent on welfare, but the thing is, that has like some very shaky, why is it that they fell into that in the first place? Right, like it has to be one or the other. Like ultimately,
and even if you're gonna say because of slavery, why'd they fall into that in the first place?
Right, exactly. Like if you go back the causal chain far enough, you're going to run into one of the two narratives: the leftist narrative or the racial narrative, I guess. The alt-right
narrative.
Right, the correct narrative. You're gonna fall back onto one of them, and the boomer doesn't want to do that. The boomer just wants to hand wave the entire thing, and I don't know. We're reaching the point where that just doesn't work, because this is the main issue in our political climate, and it just makes us all look like assholes when they do it.
We actually need the right answer at some point.
Exactly. There comes a time when you have to know how to use Excel, or else you'll start to lose your company millions of dollars, and we're in that position. So, but I would kind of like to segue the discussion into discussing the black issue in particular, because I think there is something about blacks as a group that is unique among all American non-white groups. You'll notice, for instance, that Ann Coulter will sort of defend black interests she'll do the DR3 thing for blacks. She won't do it for any other group. but she will defend blacks. And for a lot of conservatives, it's harder for them to. Like a lot of conservatives will be very aggressively, almost racist, really, against Arabs, against Mexicans, against any non-whites other than blacks. But blacks they'll defend and they'll ascribe this special status to. And I do think there's something existentially important about blacks in our nation because of that. I do think that on some level, when we do solve the racial question, whether it's through a partition or whatever, we're going to have to. I think white Americans feel obligated to cut the blacks a square deal on some level. We do feel like that's why the base black man is a thing, because we feel like when a black man is agreeing with us, he's in a sense validating us, because we feel this historical guilt for slavery. Now, it's of course misplaced because we weren't exactly the main slave traders. That was a very different group, but at the same time, we feel responsible for it, and ultimately, I don't think. Like we're gonna need to resolve the black issue in some way, and I think ultimately it's gonna be through giving them their own ethno-state, either in Africa or maybe carving it out somewhere in the Black Belt in the South. I don't know, but that is gonna have to be a thing that's done.
I don't have a great logistical answer for what I would actually do, but I know that one of the most successful rhetorical talking points I've had when talking to left-wing white people is I just tell them, like, look, we can still, like, be nice to black people if that's important to you. All I'm really saying is, can we at least be nice as white people who are conscious of who we are?
Right.
And, you know, for our magnanimity, if that's what you want, for that niceness, we don't have to be chumps. I mean, we don't have to, you know, try this failed project of assimilation or whatever you might call it. You can actually just choose to be nice. And for a lot of people, I think that does kind of lift the weight of the world off their shoulders.
Right. And see, the thing about the democratic plantation argument, ultimately it's psychologically appealing to people because they want there to be a good solution for the blacks because they feel bad about slavery and everything. But I think if you could also just make the argument like, look, the differences between blacks and whites were shrinking much more quickly under segregation than they shrunk after segregation. In fact, they pretty much stopped. And really a big chunk of that is that when blacks have to compete with whites and Asians in the free market, they're not going to enter the elite as easily. Whereas if they're just competing amongst themselves, it's a lot easier to have black professionals. Also, there was a time when black fatherlessness was actually lower than white fatherlessness, probably for the simple reason that blacks had less, mobility. They probably just had to kind of stick around in the same area, and there were just social institutions that. But still, like things weren't that bad for blacks. They might not be. They might not have had the same economic opportunities that they have nowadays, but in terms of just general happiness, in terms of having intact communities, in terms of everything like that, from a relative standpoint, they probably actually were just better off. So I think that one could make the argument to a lot of people that, hey, look, under these conditions, things would be better for them, and especially if we were to just give them their own ethno-state, and hell, if we earmarked a certain amount of spending to be sent to them as reparations every year, and they have to spend it on infrastructure and education. Like, yeah, I know it's kind of cucky. It's not like I like the policy, but I feel like whites are just so xenophilic by nature, and we feel this guilt over blacks. It would be better to do that than have to live with them in the same country. And frankly, it would probably be cheaper. So
yeah, and honestly, even if people don't want to buy the pro-segregationist argument in that, and okay, I don't mean. Like, obviously, we should be arguing for segregation, but what I mean by that is the argument that segregation was good for blacks, because some white people will just, for identitarian reasons, not believe that, and I don't know, some people are weird like that, and those people do need to be reached. I think that, to some people it does work if you say, like, well, look, if it doesn't work for them, then you can at least work within white infrastructure and white people and white culture and white unity. You can at least try and push for us to just be nice to whoever you want for any number of reasons. You can use the slavery argument if you want. Now, yes, that is kind of a concession to the left, and it's, honestly, I would be perfectly happy just to, like, let them go live and enjoy Liberia without thinking about them ever again.
Right.
But at the same time, I don't know, I'm further to the right than most people are, and I do recognize that kind of my ideal world will not be sold to some random guy in Maine.
Right. No, we need to work with the white left. We need to identify the ones among them who have the potential to be pro-white. And if their numbers, if their support gives us a strategic advantage, then yeah, we have to be willing to give the blacks a square deal in order to obtain that.
Or we at least need to, like, let them entertain the idea.
Yeah.
even if after they do like become white and they become, or I mean white nationalists, even if
Right.
they do like become,
I mean, look, even if the entire alt-right just formed an ethno-state right now, there would still be a left wing and a right wing within that state. I mean, the policies would change, the ideas would change, the debates would change.
But what I mean is that even if we do end up, convincing them otherwise, and that we should just like send people off into the cold world alone without a sweater, even if we do that, we should at least just let them know that, well, maybe maybe we're not going to say like here's the consensus and here's what I really want for our foreign relations, but that it should be something that's just acceptable and allowed and all is good and fair, with regards to them advocating for a magnanimous foreign policy. The important
Right.
thing, in my view, isn't that we aren't magnanimous. I don't know, just by aesthetic, I'm not a very magnanimous person, so maybe I would vote to be less magnanimous. But for me, the part that's really important and really indispensable and really makes it, racial unity, is that we see it as foreign policy. Like that white-black relations are foreign policy rather than we're all American. And that, even if we don't abandon the American project, as you and I spoke about, that we do still, in a way, see like white, non-white relations as foreign policy, whereas we see like American-Swedish relations as domestic policy.
Right. I can get behind that. And I think that was kind of the prevailing order of the day prior to 1965. I mean, back when the country was 90% white, 10% black. And I mean, that's probably a reason Ann Coulter and other kind of hard right people will defend blacks and black interests, is that, I mean, okay, with Mexicans, with Arabs, with all these groups, you can't really say that they have any historical claim on any part of this country whatsoever. I mean, Mexicans had a tenuous claim on the Southwest, but like there was nobody really living there, and we just took it from them really easily, so, whatever. But with blacks, they didn't come here of their own volition. They were brought here against their will. Again, it wasn't really by us, it was by other actors, but,
Well, I think there's a little bit more to it in that with blacks in particular, and I think this is why, the normie conservative has a lot more sympathy for blacks than with Native Americans. We actually don't care about Native Americans.
No, nobody gives a shit about Native Americans.
But with blacks, we made a treaty with them. And I think that's a very important, I mean, sure, it's not official, but whatever. I think that's a very important existential thing.
Wait, didn't we make treaties with the Native Americans?
Yeah, but even though those are official...
Like, we made actual official treaties with them. We just broke...
Well, actually, did we? I mean, we set aside reserves for them. We let them do gambling, and, we've upheld those treaties. They're just not existentially interesting to us, so we've moved away.
Yeah.
But in terms of with black people, we made, like, a treaty to not be racist, to treat them as equals, and so on. And, we can talk about whether we would do that again today, or even whether blacks held up to their side of the treaty or whatever. But I think white people take it very seriously that we made an agreement, and not just an agreement, but an agreement that would be agreed to in a 90% white America. Now, and conservatives kind of quote and cite Martin Luther King and all this stuff, and they've kind of retconned him, and I know this is historically nonsense, but they've kind of retconned him into a pro-white figure who would be like a based black man today.
Martin Luther King would hate Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, but I think that that's kind of because what Martin Luther King and the things he says represents is going back to an agreement that our ancestors, our recent ancestors, found agreeable and, made terms with black people, and that we, on some level, do want to uphold our side of the bargain. Now, part of, pointing out sort of anti-whiteness and why that's so sort of brutal is because it shows, or sort of brutal, like strong argumentative against the normie, is because it kind of shows, like, look, they're breaking their end of the treaty too. But I think that white people do take that agreement and that treaty very seriously. Whereas, with Mexicans, it's like we didn't even have the treaty of how they got their citizenship. So that is like a civil war getting ready to be made.
There is an element to that, but I also think on some level it's just a feeling of noblesse oblige. I mean, I think we kind of view them as so helpless. We view them as so... like they can't really defend themselves at all. I mean, if you look at just the way they live, if you look at if you look at the black on black murder rates, I mean, conservatives bring that up all the time. Conservatives love to talk about how often blacks get abortions, which... It's really funny. They talk about black abortion as genocide, like kind of stripping black women of having any agency in the process whatsoever, which, don't get me wrong, is appropriate, but not for the reasons they think.
Look, if black women couldn't kill their babies prenatally, they would kill them postnatally.
Probably. I mean, wait, is that going to get taken down from YouTube?
No, because that actually is like a shit-lib talking point.
Okay, yeah, that's true.
And if they didn't kill them postnatally, then their children would kill each other postnatally.
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing. And, like, look, we look at that and we, on some level, okay, like when we're not being directly victimized ourselves, we do feel empathy for them because, in a sense, they were never meant to live in this large-scale industrial society. They were never meant to live, like, cramped together in those close quarters in a city like Detroit. I mean, I think I think a black man could have a pretty decent life in Africa, just in a pre-industrial setting in like a jungle, like swinging around on ropes, eating, banana. Is that is that too bad for YouTube? I don't know. But I think I don't think that life would be that bad. Whereas I think, you put him in Detroit, hand him a gun, you make him like, that's just not a decent lifestyle for anybody. And I do actually, on some level,
giving guns to everybody in Detroit, I'm sorry, that will look, if that leads to a decline in gun violence, I will see mainstream conservatism in a whole new light.
Yeah. For a long time I've contended that the gun control debate is actually one of the most racially identitarian in the public arena, because ultimately what it boils down to is this country a white country? The reason being, both sides of the aisle are kind of looking at gun owners, like who are gun owners. They're looking at them in a very different light. If you're a liberal, city-dwelling urbanite, for you a gun owner is the guy who could mug you, which, let's face it, is most likely to be like a black guy. Whereas if you're a rural conservative, the typical gun owner is like your dad, right, or like your uncle. You think of gun owners as whites. So really, it's almost as like you're taking stock of America. You're making the decision, are we a nation where people can be trusted with firearms and you just have a few bad apples here and there who might use them irresponsibly? Or alternatively, are we basically a third world country where you cannot trust the randomly selected American to partake in this right? So it's unlike immigration, which is kind of like, should we be a white nation? What should the racial composition of our nation be? The gun question is almost, are we a white nation? Have we reached the point where, because I don't know, if I were living in a third world country, I might want gun control. If the population, if I were living in Somalia, yeah, I probably wouldn't want people to have guns. Yeah. But living in like a red state, I feel totally comfortable with it. It's not, it's not really even on my radar. So it is really a question. It's like an empirical question about the demographic status of our country. That's what it is.
All right, so we've been going for a bit of time, and we should wrap this up. I think as one closing question, I would like to ask. We began this podcast, we spoke at length about how we are kind of skeptical of this American unity or sort of the single state model of how white people should be. And in the second half, we seamlessly transitioned to sort of talking about this us versus them distinction in a very crisp terms, like with us with our ethnic interest, them with theirs.
Right.
That's a little contradictory. Is that something we want to address before we drop out, or are we just leaving it at that?
Well, I do think it highlights something kind of important, is that even when, we are considering these issues, we always do kind of come back to the questions that unite us. It's kind of hard to escape those. So,
like, we have a very genuinely contradictory view of how we are, and I think that to some extent, at least in the interim, I mean, I do hope that these questions we raised about sort of the existential unity of whites, I do hope that sort of becomes a paradigm and kind of one of the questions people think about and, discuss. But I at least think that in the interim, the soundest and best way to move forward probably is just to have those two types of conversations completely contradictory at first and hopefully becoming less contradictory over time as we've had time to sort of think about things and put new questions in the scope of old positions or
maybe we could just go like full boomer and not care about the contradictions in our position and
Yeah, I don't know. There is a little bit of tension there, but I think that it's a tension that reflects something real.
Right. The Faustian dilemma in our character. So, all right. Yeah, I think we've been speaking for enough. This has been a pretty good episode. So I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you for tuning in. Again, if you could go give me a follow on Twitter at WAITBISMARCK. it would be much appreciated. Thanks again, and thank you for joining me, Walt's roommate.
You're welcome. I'm very glad we could have done this 2-hour show together.
Yeah, this has been a great 2-hour show. All right. Take care, guys. Bismarck, meet Walt Bismarck in the fight to set our people free. Gonna save the white race while he's sipping Rockstar sugar-free. He will make the anti-white hordes quake with the songs he writes on his lunch break. When you're with Walt Bismarck, have a 1492 time, unnamed the Finn time, outside the Heine line.